Good afternoon to all of you. And just before I rose from my seat, because I was so impressed, as I always am, and I always learn much from Justice Antonio Carpio, and I've heard his very lengthy lecture on the West Philippine Sea, but there was something I noticed today that perhaps I did not notice when he briefed the Senate, was the proposal for the declaration by law of a protected area that would cover the disputed area, which actually belongs to the Philippines. And that would entail perhaps legislating the declaration of a marine protected area, and that would be the Spratlys Marine Protected Area Peace Park. In this instance, it would not be bilateral, unlike the other suggested areas that you've mentioned, but it would be declaration by law. So it would be my great honor, Justice Carpio, if you could kindly give me your draft. And I would be the principal author and sponsor of that measure. It would not be very difficult for me to find a member of the House of Representatives who would agree with your proposition. So if you agree, that would be great. I should have known it sooner, so we should have passed it before the budget. Yes, we'll try to speed it up, and perhaps you could ask the President to certify it as urgent, so that before the campaign season in February, which incidentally I'm not campaigning, we can enact it into law, Justice. So we have to work fast. Thank you for that very brilliant proposition. So I would like to have my first slide. This one. You're probably wondering what are all these colors. I show you this map of sea surface temperature from the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration of the United States, not to confuse us with the NOAA of the OST, but the NOAA of the US. And the red part of the oceans is the hottest part of the sea surface. Note what country lies in the middle of it. That's the Philippines. What does it actually mean? It means three simple things. One, basic atmospheric science tells us that hot water is the fuel of typhoons. In 2013, we were hit by one of the strongest typhoons in history to make landfall. Second, clearly where there is hot water, there is faster evaporation, greater condensation, greater precipitation or rain. Thus, we've experienced and will continue to experience stronger, more intense, more frequent typhoons and consequential flooding. Third, again, we learned this from basic science, because heat expands matter, the sea water is expanding around the Philippines, causing the rise in sea level. These are just some of the impacts of climate change. Coastal cities at risk. What do we mean by that? In the fifth assessment report, the IPCC, or the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, finds that each of the last 3 decades have been successively warmer at the Earth's surface than any preceding decade since 1850. Atmospheric concentrations of carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide are now at levels, and I quote, unprecedented in at least the last 800,000 years. If global temperature rises by 2 degrees Celsius, sea level rise is projected to be less than 70 centimeters. With warming of up to 4 degrees Celsius, sea level rise is projected to be more than 100 centimeters. In our recent INDC submission, or a nationally determined commitments, as one of the 154 nations that had submitted their INDCs to the UNFCCC, and the beginning of a talk starts in November 30 up to December 8, the Philippines joins other nations in making our commitments. What does the commitment state? Simply put, we said that we would indeed mitigate with financial and technical assistance from developed nations, and that is a conditional commitment of 70%. However, with all the 154 countries that have given their submissions for the INDCs, it would still, if you sum it up, increase the world's warm temperature to 2.7 degrees Celsius. What am I trying to say? At present, when we see floods in Europe, floods in Eastern Europe, floods and intense flooding in the Philippines and intense rain from Yolanda to Ondoy to Sendong, Pablo, and Lando, and that is only in a 0.8 degrees Celsius. And what we're asking for the countries to commit in COP21 would be to peg it at less than 2 degrees Celsius. In fact, it would be ideal if you could have it at 1.5 degrees Celsius. But the way we and 153 other nations in the world had submitted, based on science computations, it would come up to 2.7 degrees. And this would be catastrophic for island nations, small island states, and island countries like the Philippines of 100 million population being the third most vulnerable nation in the world. We know that oceans have acidified, having absorbed about a third of the carbon dioxide emitted. This has resulted in coral bleaching. For an archipelago like the Philippines, with 832 municipalities, 25 cities, and we have 1,634 cities and municipalities, and more than half of that, 832 and 25, these are classified as coastal areas. This unraveling scenario is a nightmare due to threats of inundation, decrease in fish catch, weak tourism in marine environments, so loss of livelihoods, source of livelihood of our fisher folks and the vulnerable poor populations in the countryside. Rising sea surface temperatures and ocean acidification are projected to cause major damage to coral reef systems. Reefs are foremost complex ecosystems that are vital to the continuity of life in the sea. I think Mr. Countryman has explained to you what they are doing in localized areas like Nasugbu in Batangas, and I hope that you could go beyond Nasugbu and do it in many other municipalities around the country. They protect coastlines from wave and storm erosion and function as nurseries and habitats for thousands of marine species. They are ultimately connected to mangrove forests, seagrass beds, and countless other ecosystems. So all these ecosystems of coral reefs and seagrass beds, of mangroves, these are very important, not only as natural buffers against storm surge, but also as a home for our fish and all for the marine biodiversity. Due to the vastness and depth of our seas, it has been a challenge for us to understand what is really happening beneath our oceans. This gives us more reason, especially that the Philippines is considered an epicenter of biodiversity and evolution, to provide special focus on marine conservation efforts. Who was it who said, I think it was the BIFAR head attorney, head of Tanggol Kalikasan before, I forget his name, Asis Perez, who said, we're the only archipelagic nation, maritime nation, that doesn't act like one. And while we have a national greening program that is funded by tens of billions of pesos for a 30 million hectare archipelago, we have 10 times more in terms of our archipelagic waters, but we don't have an NGP type counterpart for our oceans and our marine biodiversity. And that is why, as the first time chair of finance, who is a environmentalist and who was a CCA and DRR advocate, I will mainstream DRR and CCA, and for the first time, we will have a budget so huge for BIFAR and for DNR, for BMB, I think Bundita somewhere here, so that we start acting like an archipelagic nation, and we start acting like a maritime nation, because we have always tried to protect our land, our terrestrial protected areas, our forests, which is good, but we should start protecting what is left of our marine biodiversity. There are policies and ongoing efforts aimed at addressing these concerns. The DNR, you have the SCREM. I don't know if you've told them that, but the Sustainable Coral Reef Ecosystem Management Bureau. I was one of the judges once, and you have little marine protected areas in never heard cities, municipalities, far-flung areas, I think you should continue doing this and really acknowledge the LGUs and their KUSA, what is it, KUSA, their proactive measures in declaring by local ordinance of their MPAs. This is actually a national program which should cascade down to the 4th, 5th, and 6th class coastal municipalities to rehabilitate our coral reef ecosystems through a strategic, sustainable, and ecosystem-based approach. The DOST also, through its Philippine Council for Agriculture, Aquatic, and Natural Resources Research and Development, PICARD, has a program. I wish that they would continue with this, which is the Philippinovation on Coral Restoration, which I think complements CREMP. I believe that ecosystems and biodiversity preservation should not be limited to the DNR alone, but it should also be in BIFAR, it should also be in the PICARD program of the OST and many other agencies of government. And it aims to clearly restore our coral reefs in partnership with state universities and colleges, even private institutions and local government units and other stakeholders. The program has actually established coral laboratories to produce young corals that will be used to enhance and to restore our coral reefs. It attempts to identify genes that could probably help corals cope with environmental stresses brought about by climate change. Also in the Senate in 2012, we were able to ratify or concur in the ratification of the agreement between the Philippines and the ICLARM. And this is to address or to establish the office of the World Fish Center in the Philippines. What is the World Fish Center? It is supposed to establish small-scale fisheries practice and aquaculture that should contribute to improving nutrition and raising incomes in rural areas. As you see, there's so many programs of government. All we need to see is the actual output of SCREMP, of PICARD's program, of Filipinization, of the World Fish Center programs to actually empower our rural areas, our coastal rural areas. Its work on biodiversity information systems will provide scientific basis for projects involving natural resources management and aquaculture. Its work on environmental conservation, jointly with the national institutions, will be key towards fighting poverty, food security, and overall economic development. Also, the BIFAR, they have this aqua silviculture. And I visited a barangay in Nasugbu, Barangay Papaya, where the women are actually paid so that they plant the seedlings or the mangrove seedlings in those areas where the mangroves need to be resuscitated. There is also the PEMSI, the Partnerships in Environmental Management for the Sea of Southeast Asia. It has actively been pushing for countries in East Asia to adopt the integrated or the ICM coastal management concept, a mechanism we support. There's also a proposed integrated coastal management measure in the Senate, which I filed, that will create a national comprehensive framework that will promote the sustainable development of coastal and marine environment resources. This will provide the direction, support, and guidance to local government units in the development of their local agenda. The Senate has also approved, on third reading, the E-NIPAS law. What is the E-NIPAS? In 1992, long before I became senator, the Senate then, perhaps Manangleti, I think you were the author, of the original NIPAS, the National Integrated Protected Area System, which declared more than 100 terrestrial and marine protected areas as PAs. But what did it say? It said that all these protected areas, including Tubataha, including Mount Hamigitan, including many other areas, 5 PAs in Palawan, would need go through a process where there should be a presidential declaration, there should be mapping of NAMRIA, and many other processes. And so, 1992, fast forward 2015, and I realized that Senate or the Congress stopped at 13 out of declaring the 113 into national parks. What does it mean? It stayed as NIPAS, and the full enforcement of the law to give them the teeth to give them the prosecutorial powers, to give them the funding individually, was not done. Was Congress remiss? Perhaps, because it's too much politics. But perhaps we were not remiss because indeed we filed a measure to expand the NIPA's law to cover each and every protected area, terrestrial or marine. And so there was opposition because the brilliant mind said it's not possible because during their time it had to be individual legislation. But now, why is it under Senator Legarda, it can be one bill? Because even if I'm elected 10 times over, and even if my lifetime is 10 times over, I will not be able to individually legislate it. And so the brilliant mind said, yes, okay, we will agree. And there was a unanimous vote towards the enactment of the expanded National Integrated Protected Area System, despite the opposition of some who did not understand, who were finally enlightened. And I thought it would be smooth sailing since then. Now what happens? I need all your support for this. In the lower house, just because one family or one congressman would oppose the inclusion of their province and 5 protected areas in the expanded National Integrated Protected Areas, we will not have a province in the INIPAS. What would it mean? It would mean that carving out 5 protected areas so crucial in the island province of Palawan, it would mean either we would hostage the 97 others or we would have Palawan carved out of protection. So I'm in a situation where I'm not certain whether I should compromise or whether I will stand my ground. That's where we're at now. That's how difficult politics is in this country. I was trying to vent before you. I will proceed in my speech. That was not part of my speech. And so, in addressing the impacts of climate change in our communities and ecosystems, we have the climate change law. I'm so proud of this bill, which I wrote myself in 2007. And one of my mentors and consultant is the great Thani back there. Together with Thani and many other environmental minds, we wrote the climate change law. Again, there was strong opposition from the Senate. The most brilliant senator said climate change is a figment of Loren Legarda's imagination. That was 2007 in the records of the Senate. However, Ondoy happened. When Ondoy happened, unfortunately and fortunately, he said, yun palang ibig niyang sabihin. That's what she means. And so it was enacted into law. IRR was signed. The Climate Change Commission was established. President Aquino came into office. The President of the Republic is the chair of the CCC. It is now our major negotiating body in COP21 in the climate talks, not just for this year, but in the past years as well. And at the time, because politics is the art of compromise, as perhaps Justice Carpio would also agree, the People's Survival Fund, or the funding mechanism of the Climate Change Commission, was initially in our bill. But because the brilliant minds of the Senate again said, there is no need to fund climate change because you're funding an environment, you're funding in agriculture, because it's just a figment of these young girls, I was still young then, imagination. So let's not fund it. I agreed. Swallowed my pride, I agreed, so that we create the commission. And I said, when these people are out of office, I'm going to file the funding mechanism of the People's Survival Fund. And so then Senate President Enrile filed the PSF. I was the chairman of the Environment Committee. And so I was able to enact it into law. So magkapatid po yan, Siamese twins, half in the middle, and between my 2 terms, I was able to put them together. And so we have the full extent of the law. Again, in the beginning, they said, oh, let's not fund it. It was an unfunded law. And they put it in a program fund. Did I complain? How can you complain with the brilliant minds of the Senate again who did not agree? But they elected a female chairman of the Finance Committee. I'm funding the People's Survival Fund for 1 billion in program fund. And what they don't know is a 3.002 trillion budget will be a climate adaptive, disaster resilient, risk sensitive 3 trillion budget. Because before they said, we will climate tag the budget. 129 billion of the budget will be about climate. DPWH, that era, I said, if you can build a road and tag it as climate sensitive. If you build a school building and say that your school building or classroom is climate adaptive, why can't you build all buildings that way? Why can't you build all roads that way? Why can't you plant resilient crops that way, etc.? And so why just tag a measly 4% of our budget? Why not make it a climate adaptive budget? And so that's what I'm doing now. I'm not certain if they will agree when my sponsorship comes, but that is my plan. So you have the first information about that. Back to oceans. If we want to protect our oceans and marine ecosystems from the impact of climate change, we have to mitigate. You ask me, why should we mitigate when we are not even a 1% emitter in the world? Because it makes good environmental sense, because it makes good business sense, because it makes good common sense to mitigate, even if we're a 0.03% emitter in the world. We have to drastically reduce carbon emissions because our seas may no longer take too much of it. Towards the end of November, November 30, delegations from 196 member states of the United Nations will gather in France to negotiate for our future, and heads of state of these countries will commit or not commit to urgent climate action. The Philippines, as I said, is a very minor emitter of GHG, less than 0.3% of global greenhouse gas emissions. But because we are among the top 3 nations most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, we have to call upon other nations, especially developed countries, to have the historical responsibility for climate change to reduce their carbon emissions. As I speak before you now, the ClimateVulnerable Forum is happening in Diamond Hotel, where 20 nations, 20 most vulnerable nations in the world, are meeting with their senior ministers of DRR. I addressed them in my keynote yesterday morning, and we are increasing the membership of the ClimateVulnerable Forum to perhaps 20 more countries, so we'll have a stronger voice in the world. The Philippines is the president of this year till July of 2016. It was born out of an idea in 2009 with the UNISDR and myself when we visited the Maldives, and I spoke to then President of Maldives, Nasheed, who has been, since then he's been out of office. I think he's in jail now. But at the time, but he's an environmentalist, but at the time he agreed that we must set up the ClimateVulnerable Forum. And that was, as head of state, I'm not a head of state, so he was able to bring it to the UNDP. And to make a long story short, 4 countries have already hosted the CVF, including Bangladesh, Costa Rica, and the Philippines is the president and is hosting it as I speak to you now. More importantly, we have to walk our talk. As Justice Carpio has mentioned, as Mr. Countryman has mentioned, as many more will speak about it today. We cannot demand other nations to progressively decrease their dependence on fossil fuels if our very own vulnerable nation continues to choose coal over renewable energy sources. We have to go low carbon ourselves, otherwise we lose the moral high ground as we call on other parties to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. We call on other nations as we do our own share to limit warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius to be able to survive. The future of our oceans and that of us humans relies on how much action we are willing to take today. Certainly, there is no panacea for this, but a united front against the causes of marine ecosystems decline is our greatest weapon in our long and arduous journey, and this gathering is a great, vital step towards our fight for a sustainable future. Thank you very much.